Okay, test. All right. Hi, everyone. Sorry I'm a couple minutes late. I had to run real fast over to my office from my previous class. So, this light is in the way here. But good morning, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. Um, so today, what the plan is to finish off our discussion of universals. Before we do that, a couple more housekeeping things, real quick. Um, so, all right. Let's make sure that my slides are here. Yes, they are. Let's go from the beginning. So, before we get started, a couple of things. Um, So I've released the feedback or the grades at any rate for the first test. Everything except the makeup test. If you wrote the makeup test, which was for those who didn't complete the test because they were ill or because of some other emergency, I'll have those ready within the next day or so. But everyone else who didn't write the makeup test, who just wrote the test proper, has their grades. Um, I've been getting some questions about feedback. Now, I know on the ones that I marked, I left feedback on some questions. I'm not sure if the TAs did this. I told them to keep comments to a minimum, and I think that they probably had so much to do that in a lot of cases, comments weren't left, which is fine because what I'm planning to do, rather than meet with everyone who wants to speak to me individually, is I'm probably going to make a little video where I will review the answers to the test questions. So I wanted to put that question to everyone here. Um, again, I'm not sure how that works. There should be some student documentation online that you can find. I only know Brightspace. I only really know the instructor side of Brightspace, unfortunately. Um, your grades should be available in. I mean, you should when the grades were released, you will have gotten an email, I think, which should have a link that will take you to the grade. Um, again, um, so yeah, okay. So again, I have to admit I'm really not sure how the student side of Brightspace works. Um, but it looks like somebody in the chat here has the right answer. So class progress, drop down menu at the top, then the grade section. Um, so again, not knowing, I can try and find the documentation. Actually, let's maybe I can find it now. Let's try and find it now, and then I can share it in the chat. So let's see. How do I view my grades on Brightspace? Um, should make sure we're at the right university, Carleton University. Okay, let's see. Log into Brightspace. Okay, courses, nav bar, and the drop-down menu, select grades, and you can see. Okay, so here, um, viewing grades. I'll share this in the chat for everyone. Anyway, what I was trying to oh, that's cool, Daisy. I didn't know about that. Yeah, see, the thing is, when I was a student here, we didn't use Brightspace. We used CU Learn. We transitioned to Brightspace, I think just before or right around the time everything went online due to COVID. Um, So I'm not really familiar, as I said, with the student side of things when it comes to Brightspace. However, yeah, so here it looks like you can go into this menu and you'd be able to see your grade on the quiz, and you should probably be able to um go and look at your answers as well. You can like view your attempt at the quiz. Um, okay, I'll have to look into why the answers are restricted. I'm not sure why that would be the case, but I'll look into that and I'll make sure that you can see your answers because the plan is that I will create yeah. Okay, so I'll have to look into that. But what I'm trying to say is that I will create a video. Probably we'll get to it toward the end of the week or over the weekend, where I'll review the answers, the correct answers for the multiple choice and for the short answer questions. And then once we figure out how to make it so that you can view your attempt at the quiz, you'll be able to compare your answers to the video and see what you did right, what you did wrong. I think that would be just easier than meeting with everyone individually because I have so many people um, that are wanting to review their test. Um, yeah, so that's what I'll try and do. It might take me a few days to do it, but I'll make sure that it gets done. So, with that said, we can go on to the lecture. Um, oh boy, is this ever a dense chapter, right? A lot of metaphysics, a lot of very abstract stuff. So last time we learned about universals, particularly realist views, strong realism about universals. So if you're a strong realist about universals, like Plato, for example, you believe that universals exist over and above the particular entities that instantiate those properties, right? So there are, green apples, green pears. There's a green plant over there in my office. Over and above all of these individual instantiations of the property green, if you're a realist, you would say that there exists a non-physical universal greenness. And we need these universals to explain things like abstract reference. I can say this thing and this thing and this thing are all green. Um, I can talk about them in the abstract, and I can talk about how their attributes agree with one another. They're all green items. Um, Realists would say that we need universals to be able to explain abstract reference and attribute agreement. So, yep, that's what I'm doing now. So that's the long and short of it, basically. Like we can talk about we can abstract away from particular things. So, this good act and that good act, oh, so and so donated to charity. They also helped their nephew with his homework. They also helped their neighbor plow the driveway after the heavy snowfall. Those were all good acts. We're abstracting away from the particular acts themselves and referring to some property that's like out there, the universal, the good. An attribute agreement, right? Things can agree in the attributes or properties that they instantiate. And that's kind of what the green apple, the green pear, Kermit the Frog, they're all particular entities that instantiate a property. They all share an attribute, greenness, right? So a strong realist says that those things are universals and they really exist. And Plato would be an example of a strong realist about universals because Plato thought that the universals are really what they are perfect forms or ideas. And Plato is an especially strong realist because he thinks that the forms are more real than the particulars. So the form of a triangle, the perfect form, is more real than any triangle that you could draw uh, on your chalkboard or in the sand or anything like that. That's the gist of Monday's material. Now, the other end of that spectrum, the other extreme is nominalism, and nominalism pertains to names, and on nominalism, there are no universals, only individuals, only particulars. So nominalism is associated with an English medieval philosopher named William of Ockham. And you may have heard of Ockham, particularly Occam's razor. William of Ockham is also famous for Occam's razor, which oftentimes is given as the simplest answer is most likely the correct answer. But the more precise formulation of Occam's razor is do not multiply entities beyond necessity. And entities in Occam's razor means something like theoretical entities. So let's try and generate an example of applying Occam's razor. And then we'll try and see how Occam's razor fits into the nominalist view that there are no universals. So can we think of an example of two or more competing explanations where the correct explanation for a particular phenomenon is the simpler one? So we can do this in the chat, or feel free to hop on via voice if you wish. Oh, excuse me. But what we're looking for here, again, is some phenomenon in need of explaining, and we have two competing explanations, and we're looking for the simpler one because the simpler one turns out to be the correct one. Can we think of some examples? I'd say yes. Yeah, you could certainly use that as an example. Yeah, the geocentric one was way more complex and multiplied entities beyond necessity. Yeah, that's right. Assumptions, theoretical entities are you can treat them as assumptions here. Nick, the example of the geocentric solar system versus the heliocentric is a good one. Because the geocentric model involves all these weird assumptions or entities about perfect crystal spheres and whatnot. Yeah, Funmi, that's a good one. A ghost who took it. If you're missing something, you don't assume a ghost took it. That's right. Um, uh, yeah, did my cat smash the plant or did an alien? Well, if an alien did it, then I've got quite a lot of unwarranted assumptions going on, don't I? Oh, and maybe this is more hypochondriasis than multiplying entities beyond necessity, but yeah, you're probably right. The simpler explanation is that maybe there's a simpler explanation for your headache other than that you have the Black Death, right? Um, I really like this example, the ghost. You know, in science, we call this the principle of parsimony. Um, and you can see that pseudosciences like astrology or parapsychology violate this principle. So parapsychology is stuff like would include everything from trying to study extrasensory perception to looking for ghosts. And unfortunately, um, the explanations for the phenomena that parapsychologists investigate have a lot of unwarranted assumptions, right? Now, if you're a nominalist and you're following Occam's razor, you're going to say, like, well, universals, that's an unwarranted assumption. That's an unnecessary entity. We don't need those. There's nothing to explain. I mean, my apples are green, my pears are green, my plant is green, Kermit the Frog is green. Um, but I don't need to posit some universal that exists over and above all of those particulars to explain greenness. I would be violating Occam's razor if I did that. So it's simpler just to say that only individuals exist. Um, we don't need universals to explain either abstract reference or attribute agreement. Now, there are lots of different kinds of nominalism, but there are two that Crumley focuses on here. The first is strict nominalism. And then we have varieties of resemblance nominalism. So on strict nominalism, when I utter sentences that refer to or that seem to refer to universals, I'm really just referring to individuals. So say I utter sentences like, this apple is green, that pear is green, Kermit the Frog is green. When I refer to green, or when I think about green, I'm not referring to or thinking about a universal that is greenness. I just have three different green entities. I have three green particulars. That's it. But then a realist would counter by saying, well, hang on, how do we explain attribute agreement? How do we explain the fact that these three green items agree in their greenness without positing the existence of some universal, form of the green or something? A nominalist would just say that, well, there's nothing more to explain. It's just a basic metaphysical fact that this apple is green, that pear is green, Kermit the Frog is green, and so forth. And I think Quine unpacks this quite well. There's a quote on page 158 in Crumbly, which I'll read to you now. This is from a paper Quine wrote called On What Exists. He writes, one may admit that there are red houses, roses, and sunsets, but deny, except as a popular and misleading manner of speaking, that they have anything in common. The words houses, roses, and sunsets are true of sundry individual entities, which are houses and roses and sunsets, and the word red or red object is true of each of sundry individual entities, which are red houses, red roses, and red sunsets. But there is not, in addition, any entity whatever, individual or otherwise, which is named redness. That the house and the roses and the sunsets are all of them red may be taken as ultimate and irreducible, and it may be held that the realist is no better off in point of real explanatory power for all the occult entities which he posits under such names as redness. So what Quine is saying is that, look, there are particular red objects, sundry individual entities, different separate individual entities that are red, like different red houses and red roses and red sunsets. But beyond just sharing the name red, there's nothing else in common between the two of them. There's no redness that exists over and above all of these red particulars that Quine is naming here. It's just a basic metaphysical fact that here we have a red house, there we have a red rose, over there we have a red sunset. But redness does not exist separately apart from those things. And that's why nominalism is called nominalism. Nominalism means pertaining to names. And nominalism emphasizes uh, the idea that when we refer to this green thing, that green thing, or that green thing, we're not referring to a universal. We're just using a name to pick out three green particulars, and there's nothing else that needs explaining beyond that. So under this assumption, aren't lone numbers fundamentally incorrect because numbers need to refer to some entity? Yeah, you know what? I have to admit that I'm not really sure what a nominalist would do about numbers. Um, it seems to me like, okay, maybe you can say that, I mean, I guess they would say that numbers are just names for quantities that you could find in the world. I think a lot of mathematicians would probably disagree with that line of thinking. I mean, there do seem to be a lot of um, Platonists. When if you ever talk to mathematicians, a lot of them are Platonists or like Platonists about numbers. So they'd be realist about numbers. Um, but I'm not a mathematician, so perhaps that's all I should say about this. So that was strict nominalism. Are there any other questions about strict nominalism before we move on to resemblance? Oops, before we move on to resemblance nominalism. All right, so question here. Uh, I find it interesting because we identify red, green, and blue. We say a pear is green, apples can be green, but not every person or animal can see green, red, or blue. So how can we really say that there isn't an even broader color scale that we can't perceive? So how can we claim anything is for fact green or any color? Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, there are, of course, the colors that we see are a really small slice of the electromagnetic spectrum. Of course, birds and butterflies, other insects, can see into the ultraviolet. So they can see colors that we can't. Rather like a dog can see some of the colors that we can see, but not all of them. Yeah, I mean, really, it depends on, I mean, these are metaphysical positions, right? Um, we can't answer these questions by doing a scientific experiment. Um, so yeah, I mean, think about it. This would mean if you're a realist about colors, color universals, then I suppose you would have to admit that there exist color universals that no human can perceive, um, like the ultraviolet ones, right? I suppose that's what I would have to say to that comment. But that's a good one. That's really good. That gave me something to think about. And of course, if you're a nominalist, you would just say, well, yeah, maybe there are particular occurrences of particular colors that we can't see or know anything about for other animals, like birds and bees and butterflies and so forth. Um, maybe we could come up with names for them if we could, but we can't experience them. Even if we have one of those sciency cameras, right? On those nature documentaries, they do that sometimes. They say, here's the ultraviolet camera. This is what a bird looks like to another bird. And it's like, well, no, that's what that bird looks like through the ultraviolet camera to a human. It's not, we have no idea what it looks like to a bird. But it's a way of making the colors we can't see salient to us, right? Anyway, so we covered strict nominalism. Now let's cover resemblance nominalism. Now, realists, when it comes to strict nominalism, a realist might protest. A realist might say, well, hey, hang on. Strict nominalism doesn't explain why our ordinary view or our intuition, if everyone indeed shares this intuition that there are universals, it doesn't explain why that's mistaken. It just says, oh, there aren't universals. There are just particular things. It just seems like there are universals because we use the same name to refer to different particulars. Um, you know, the green apple, the green pear, the green car, so on. But it doesn't explain why that view is wrong. It just says that it is wrong. Maybe resemblance nominalism can help us here then. So resemblance nominalism makes the claim that we classify individuals because they have a resemblance in some important way to one another. We still don't need to posit universals here. We group green items together because they resemble one another. The green apple resembles the green pear in terms of its color, not because there exists a universal of greenness. So when we use these names to refer to green things, for example, what we're doing is referring to members of a class or a category. We could call this a resemblance class. So there's no universal of greenness. There's a resemblance class of green things. And when we talk about green items, green individuals, or what we think about them, what we're doing is talking about or thinking about members of that class, not some universal that exists over and above the members of that class. Okay, so that does a little bit more explanatory work than resemblance nominalism, but maybe it raises another worry for realists. What if we get the classes wrong? So Crumley's example here is dogs. So a realist is going to say maybe there's a universal, being a dog, which exists over and above all the individual dogs that we could think of. But maybe a resemblance nominalist would say that instead of a universal, what we have here are just members of a class of beings that are all descended from wolves or something, right? And that's a very motley crew indeed. On page 160, Crumley writes, members of this class include an Irish setter, which resembles a golden retriever, which resembles a bulldog, which resembles the Terrytoons cartoon character Deputy Dog, which resembles creatures from the infamous Star Wars bar scene, one of which resembles a Yorkshire Terrier, which resembles a cat from a former neighbor once, a former neighbor once knew. A cat? Well, a cat's not a dog. So what Crumley's trying to say here with this example is, the boundaries between these classes could get a little bit fuzzy. When you say get the classes wrong, could that be like, could you get the color wrong? Yeah, I suppose. Some people are better at distinguishing between different hues of color than others. So I suppose that maybe I'd say something, oh, look at that purple over there. And maybe someone else who's better with colors would say, purple, you're crazy. That's magenta. Right? Yeah, I suppose. Here the idea is that there are not clear distinctions between classes because, like, okay, this dog resembles this dog, which resembles this dog, but eventually you might come upon a dog that resembles something that's not a dog more than it resembles dogs. So that's a problem. If our classes are based upon resemblance, then how do we draw the lines between different classes? One potential answer is family resemblance, and this comes from Wittgenstein. I think I've mentioned him in this course before, but he was an Austrian philosopher from the early to mid 20th century. Excuse me. And he thought that we could make some sense out of all of this if we pay closer attention to the way we think and speak ordinarily. And so sometimes this is called ordinary language philosophy. And when we read into Wittgenstein, this is tricky stuff because it comes from the Philosophical Investigations, and that's a collection of notes, kind of like his notebook that was published after his death by one of his students. It was translated by Gertrude Anscombe. So um, it's not an easy read. You kind of have to do a little bit of interpretation and exegesis to make sense of it. But in the investigations, if you read it closely, you can see that he seems to be a nominalist, not a realist. Why? Well, it's the way we use language that dictates how we group things together by resemblance. The rules of the language game, he might say. It's not the existence of universals above and beyond particulars. He uses the example of games to illustrate this. Games form a family, he said in the investigations. Let's try and think of games. Just give me some games, some examples of games. You can do it in the chat or via voice. Okay, I'll start. Chess. Chess is a game. Tag is a game. Good. Scrabble. Yes. Keep them coming. Let's do some more. All right. So here's some good ones. So all of these we play with other people. That's one way they resemble one another. But in other ways, they're different. Some of them are played on a field, like soccer. Some are played on a board, like Scrabble or Monopoly or Catan. Some are played with cards, like Crazy Eights, Poker, and Solitaire. Some are played on a court, like basketball, but they're all played. They all have some things in common with one another, even though they're a little bit different from one another. Um, kind of like members of a family. They're all kind of similar to one another, but they're different individuals. This is the notion of family resemblance. Um, so Bambara, or Bambara, not sure if I'm saying that right, went so far as to claim that thanks to this notion of family resemblance, uh, Wittgenstein actually managed to solve the dispute between realists and nominalists. And that's because it explains why we collect together individuals the way we do. They have differences, sure, but they also have overlapping similarities. And there are ways in which we talk about those overlapping similarities and think about them. And that's what allows us to collect them together. You can also think of these as cluster concepts, right? Which is different from the classical view of concepts, which we haven't really looked at. So I'm not really going to say anything beyond this um, about about concepts until we get to conceptualism. But I think you all get the idea, right? I mean, these are all games. We all call them games, but look how different they are from one another, right? Some are played on a field, some on a court, some at a table, some on a board, some with cards, some you keep score, um, some you don't. I mean, when you play tag, I mean, a game of tag can just go on until you get tired of playing tag, right? Um, you don't really keep score. It's just someone's it, and they try to make it so that you're it. It doesn't refute the example. It just helps us understand how we draw the boundaries. Because the worry is, if we go back to resemblance nominalism, it's like, well, what's stopping us from counting a cat that looked like a dog I once knew in with our class of dogs? Well, Wittgenstein would say, well, the way we think and talk about cats and dogs is what keeps them in separate classes. That's what this does for us. So, you see what I mean? Okay, perfect. And then we got on a trope theory. Well, first, before we go on, are there any more questions? You can just, if you have any questions, you can add them to the chat. I know we don't have quite as many slides today, but they are very, like, this is pretty dense stuff. So I really want to stop and kind of check in as we go, make sure everyone's following along. That's true. But I would say that um, while there are overlapping similarities, there are probably not enough similarities. Like you can win a war or lose a war, like you can win a game or lose a game. But certainly nobody goes to war for fun. Like we play games for fun. Then again, I mean, maybe the similarities are stronger for some games than others. I mean, a lot of great generals throughout history have also been chess players. I don't know if they've been particularly good chess players, but um, the idea is that chess is like the battlefield, I suppose. Although in chess, no one dies, which is nice. Oh, the Hunger Games. Oh, yeah, actually, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. Those games don't sound very fun. Um, Posit? Posit means to propose or to state or say. So if I posit universals, I'm saying I think universals exist. No problem. Happy to help. So another interesting type of nominalism is trope resemblance nominalism. So what is a trope? You may have heard this word before. Um, Tropes occur in movies and television and books, right? There might be different tropes. Um, Maybe we can think of some examples. What's a trope that we see in entertainment? And go ahead and answer in the chat if you like. Enemies to lovers, that's a good one. Yeah. One that I see a lot of because I'm a science fiction guy is we make some robots or AI, and then that AI rebels and kills all humans, right? That's a yeah, yeah, the learner and the master. They're like little things that occur again and again, elements of storytelling or something like that. Yeah, the secret lover on a soap opera, right? So in philosophy, tropes are quite different. So there's a sort of everyday usage of this word, which is what your examples are highlighting. And then in philosophy, there's the technical term, trope. I've heard tropes described as individual token-like things. So what is a token, you might ask? Well, think of it like this. If we have types, they'd be like categories or classes. So dogs, cats, right? A dog is a type of creature. A cat is a type of creature. Tokens are individuals from those types. So Rover the dog is a token of a type of being, a dog. Mittens the cat is a token of a kind of being, another type of being, a cat, right? Crumley also describes tropes as particularized properties. So make sense of it like this. I have two cats at home. They weren't able to join us today because they're at home and I'm in my office. But they're siblings with one another, so they're pretty similar. One has long orange fur. Oh, I misspelled orange. Long orange fur. The other has some short white fur, but also some short orange fur. But the shade of their fur is the same shade of orange. So there's two tropes, two particularized properties here. One of the tropes is the shade of orange that is the one cat's fur, and the other trope is the shade of orange that is the other cat's fur. So tropes are like little individual particular properties. Even though the orangeness of each of my cat's fur is the same, we wouldn't say, if we're trope resemblance nominalists, that that's because of some universal orangeness that both cats instantiate. Instead, we would say that there are just two different tropes and they resemble one another. So this is a way to try and make resemblance nominalism even more precise. So if family resemblance doesn't do the job, maybe trope resemblance does. There are all kinds of individual tropes, these particularized properties out there in the world. And sometimes, everything is really like a collection of tropes. And some of these tropes resemble other tropes, and we classify things together on that basis. But a realist would say, wait a minute, that's not simpler than the claim that there are universals. That's really complicated. Like what? There are like infinite tropes and everything is some kind of bundle of tropes. That's multiplying entities beyond necessity, isn't it? So maybe like a strict nominalist would say that a trope resemblance nominalist has violated Occam's razor and multiplied entities beyond necessity. They have way more assumptions at play than there need to be. And besides, a realist would say, you've let universals sneak back in the back door, Mr. Trope Theorist. Um, Bertrand Russell said all nominalists, it could be strict resemblance or trope resemblance, have to admit at least one universal, and that is the universal that is resemblance. So maybe we cannot escape universals, even if we want to, on nominalism. We can deny that they exist, but when we say that this resembles that, whether we think it's just two individual entities, that we use the same word to refer to some aspect of, whether it's family resemblance or trope resemblance, the idea of resemblance, Russell is saying, is a universal. So nominalists can't get away from it. Any questions so far? Go ahead and drop them in the chat. Okay, so we are making our way through the material at a decent pace. Maybe we'll even finish a couple of minutes early. This next bit, I depart quite a bit from Crumley, and that's moderate realism. I talked about this a little bit last time, but not very much. Moderate realism says that universals exist, but they're not separate from the objects that instantiate them. They're in the objects themselves. So, for example, Aristotle was a moderate realist. Excuse me, I had to cough there. So Plato was a strong realist. Plato was Aristotle's teacher. Aristotle was his most famous student. Um, so where Plato says that forms exist over and above separately from individual appearances in the world, Aristotle says no. The forms are in the objects, not separate from them. So to make sense of this, you kind of have to understand where Aristotle's coming from, and Aristotle's metaphysics are tricky. But one important idea, I think, is hylomorphism, which means like matter formness, right? Matter needs, to be a thing, to be anything. Matter needs a form, and form needs matter. Without form, matter is just matter. It's just stuff. It's not anything in particular, right? Um, and without matter, a form is nothing. Just maybe an idea or a plan. It's nothing. We need both matter and form to understand, to have a thing and to understand what it is. So, and by the way, we grasp the form of various objects with the intellect, not with the senses. So, yes, Aristotle is often counted as an empiricist. And eventually, when we first encounter different things in the world, we become aware of them with the senses. So, yes, that's true. But we abstract uh, via a process of abstraction, we grasp the essence or the intelligible form of individual entities. It's as if we extract the universals. Take cups, for example. Maybe you know, I, I extract the universal of the cup from all my encounters with cups over my entire life. And I see this cup with my senses. I see all the other cups with my senses, but I extract from that using my intellect the intelligible form that is the cup. And that's part of the essence of what this is. Um, in fact, um, for Aristotle, invoking Platonic sort of forms or perfect ideas doesn't really help us make sense of individual entities. It's kind of an extra unnecessary step. Maybe this will become a little clearer if we talk about Aristotle's theory of causality. So Aristotle understands causality a lot differently than you're probably used to thinking of causality. So when we talk about cause and effect, yeah, matter exists. It's just stuff. It's just raw material. It's not anything, right? The matter needs what Aristotle probably would have said it would just be a basic element without form. All you've got are earth, air, fire, and water, right? What he thought were the four fundamental elements. Um, But every entity, every object, every being, everything has to be made of matter, and it also has to have a form, but the form is in the matter, right? It's in the object. So you'll see with this example here, if we review this theory of causality. So Aristotle's theory of causality is different from how we talk about causality today. Usually when we talk about causality today, we're talking about physical causes and effects, the kinds of causes and effects that David Hume was interested in, right? Think of like billiard balls, right? The cue stick strikes the cue ball, which strikes the 8 ball, which rolls into the corner pocket. A causes B, causes C, causes D. That's how we're used to thinking of causality. But Aristotle thinks about it very differently. So Aristotle's theory of causality says that to explain the essence of a thing, you actually need uh, 4 causes. You have to explain these 4 causes. So let's take, one example I believe comes from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Excuse me. Comes from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's article on Aristotle, on hylomorphism, I think. One of the articles on Aristotle. It escapes me at the moment. But you need to understand the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, and the final cause. Now, the material cause is what it's made out of, the matter. So if we go with this bronze cast of Zeus, a little statue of Zeus that's cast by pouring molten bronze into a mold, well, the material cause is the bronze itself, and the formal cause is the form that it takes, the form of the god Zeus. And then we have our efficient cause, which is the artisan who made the cast. And then we have the final cause, and that's what the cast is for, its purpose, or its telos in ancient Greek. This cast might be for appreciating, like maybe it's a work of art. Maybe it's meant to serve as a paperweight. Maybe it's meant to be an object of worship. But whatever its purpose is, that's the final cause. So the intelligible form, the formal cause, is in the entity itself. It's in the bronze. You could say that for Aristotle and for moderate realists, that universals are not separate from, but are immanent. They're not separate from entities, they're immanent. They're in the entity all the time. Now, this view has some interesting elements in common with conceptualism and some in common with and some important it has differences similar that what am I trying to say? Oh my goodness. I'm trying to say that um moderate realism shares some interesting similarities and differences with the next view, conceptualism. But before we move on to conceptualism, does anyone have any questions? Justification for induction kind of issues of resemblances. Yeah, I guess in a way it is. Because think of the uniformity principle, right? The future will resemble the past. Well, that's not an analytic statement. It's not a deductive statement. It's inductive. But when we try to justify it, we're kind of stuck because the only way we can justify it is with induction. So we've identified a regularity, but there's nothing necessary about that. And that was the problem that Hume identified, and that was the thing that awakened Immanuel Kant from his dogmatic slumber. It's like, oh, geez, I need to save cause and effect here because otherwise we're in trouble. So I guess you could say that, yeah. Any other questions before we move on to conceptualism? Well, I think we just have this one last slide. Yep. So we're actually making our way faster than I thought. So maybe I can take some questions about the test at the end of this. Oh, I think I know why we can't view the test. Oh, it's because after the test ends, maybe access is restricted. So I need to make it so that you can still see the test. Okay, that might be what the problem is. I just thought of that right now. Okay. Anyway, yeah, back to conceptualism. This is due to Peter Abelard, who was a French philosopher. Now, as Crumley points out, Abelard has actually been interpreted in different ways. He's been interpreted as a moderate realist, a nominalist, and a conceptualist. We're going to interpret him as a conceptualist because for Abelard, what universals are concepts that exist in the mind. They refer to lots of non mental objects, but they are in the mind. This is why we're not treating him as a realist, not even a moderate realist, because remember, on what realism means is that whatever we're realists about exists mind independently, right? So Plato is a strong realist because universals exist and they're separate from their particulars. They exist over and above those particulars. In this case, he believed they existed as ideas or perfect forms in some sort of metaphysical great beyond, right? The important thing is they're mind independent. We grasp them with the mind, but they exist independently of the mind. If there were no people around, Plato would say the forms would still exist. Aristotle's a moderate realist because he says, yeah, the form is in the thing. It's not in your mind. You can grasp it with your mind via a process of abstraction, but the form is there in the cast of Zeus, not in your mind. But Abelard is saying no, no. The universals are not out there in some metaphysical beyond or in some realm of the forms or even in the objects themselves. No, they're in the mind and they refer to non-mental objects. So here you might think of universals on conceptualism as mental particulars. So they're universal in the sense that I can use them to think about many different particulars. Um, but it exists as a concept in my mind, not as something out there in the world. That's why we're not treating Abelard as a realist, either strong or weak. But there are some similarities between his position and moderate realism. Um, I because on Abelard's view, universals are concepts. I still discover them via the intellect, via this sort of process of abstraction. Well, I've got to plug my computer in. One moment, please. Hey, got my handy cable here. I can plug in my laptop. Yeah, so I discover these universals via abstraction, but I'm not discovering them like, oh, there it is in the object. I understand now. That's not how I'm discovering them. Yeah, Theo. Realism about anything just means that it can exist independently of a mind there to perceive it or think about it. Like take this cup, right? If I walk out of my office, The cup doesn't poof out of existence just because I'm not looking at it, right? Um, uh, so when it comes to universals, Plato says they exist separately from the particulars, separately from minds. Same with Aristotle, although they're not, for Aristotle, they're not over and above the particulars, they're in the particular objects. Um, and we discover them with the intellect. Likewise with conceptualism, but I don't on moderate realism. What I'm doing, according to Aristotle, is I'm grasping the intelligible form, which is in the object with the intellect. But for Abelard, how I discover these universals is that I abstract away all the individual differences, and whatever is left is the universal. So take dogs again, right? I've seen a lot of individual dogs, but if I extract away all the individual details, like, oh, this dog was this color, this dog had floppy ears, this one had pointed ears, what I'm left with is something like, okay, mammal, 4 legs, barks, likes to play fetch, right? Descended from wolves. That's what I'm left with after abstracting away all the little individual differences between every single dog I've encountered. That's the universal, and it's a concept that exists in my mind, not out there in the world. Yes, a coffee cup example, sure. So I've seen lots of different coffee cups. I've seen coffee cups made of fine china, made of crappy porcelain. I've seen them made of glass. This one is made of cardboard, right? Um, when I abstract away all those details, what I'm left with is a concept that's something like a cup for holding coffee. Um, I can drink out of it. It keeps my coffee warm. Coffee goes in the cup. Coffee gets sipped out of the cup. And that's my concept of coffee cup. Once I've taken away all the individual details, like some coffee cups have handles. This one doesn't because it's made of cardboard. It has a sleeve. I've even seen a coffee cup that had the handle on the inside of the mug. So it was called the idiot mug. You couldn't, you didn't pick it up like this. The handle was on the inside, I guess, because an idiot would reach into the hot coffee and try and pick it up that way, I suppose. I don't know. It's a joke coffee cup, but it still held coffee and you could still drink out of it. So, um, some coffee cups have writing on them, right? I love New York or Carleton University or something. If I take all those little things away, whatever I'm left with is my concept, my universal. Does that help? They would say the coffee cup still exists. They're realist about objects in the world, but they're conceptualist about universals. So coffee cups really exist in the world. My concept of a coffee cup is a mental item. Yeah, I think I like conceptualism too. There's something about moderate realism that I like as well. Both of those are appealing to me. Um, and I guess I went through a sort of Wittgensteinian phase in grad school where I mean maybe his family resemblance appealed to me. I like family resemblance for cluster concepts. Um, since we're on the topic of concepts, I mean the classical view of concepts is about defining things in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions, which is tricky to do. Um, maybe family resemblance and the notion of a cluster concept can help us there, but that's kind of beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. I've got here, yeah, you go to the coffee cup example because I always have a cup of coffee with me when I'm lecturing, especially in the morning. So it's just like, oh, what can I use? Oh, there's a coffee cup. Perfect. And it contains coffee, which has caffeine, which I like. So I thought that we would try and come up with some examples to highlight the differences between moderate realism and conceptualism, but I don't know if that's really necessary. I think the important thing to remember is that for conceptualism, the universal is a mental item, so it's in here. On moderate realism, the universal is an intelligible form, and it's in the object itself. And we also, another important difference is that we discover these universals a little bit differently. In both cases, we do it with the intellect, but in the case of moderate realism, we use the intellect to grasp the form that is in the coffee cup or the cast of Zeus or the dog. But on conceptualism, we abstract away all the individual differences between every member of that category. Whatever's left is our essential concept. Any questions? How are we doing for time? We got about 10 minutes left. Uh, is nihilism a recognized philosophy? Off topic, but I wanted to know. Yeah, nihilism is a school of philosophy. Nihilism is where you believe in nothing, right? Like, has anyone seen the film The Big Lebowski? There's some nihilists in that movie. So they believe in nothing. Although they're not really not. They actually do care about some things. But yeah, nihilism comes from the Latin nihil, which means nothing. Yeah, it's a great movie. Um, I have a pretty cool Big Lebowski shirt. I'll have to wear it for our next lecture. Show it off. Um, but anyway, nihilism is associated with Schopenhauer, Arthur Schopenhauer. Arthur Schopenhauer. I had an undergraduate professor when I was when I was an undergraduate. I had a professor who claimed that reading Schopenhauer made him physically ill because Schopenhauer's writing papers like the emptiness of existence. You know, it's basically just like life is horrible and life is pain, and then you die. Wonderful, lovely ray of sunshine, Schopenhauer. Um, Sometimes Nietzsche is also associated with nihilism, but Nietzsche's not really a nihilist. He's more like trying to find solutions to overcome nihilism. Like Nietzsche's like, yes, life is hard and the world is a cruel, irrational place, but what are you going to do? Just sit there and be upset about it? Or are you going to live your best life? What are you going to do about it, right? So unfortunately, in this book, there aren't too many philosophers outside of the Western canon, which is really unfortunate, because there's a really rich, a series of rich philosophical traditions all over the world. And you know, it's funny, the last time I taught this class, I used a completely different approach where I surveyed a lot of those different philosophies from around the world. But the problem was I just didn't have the time to it ended up being more like a history of philosophy class rather than a metaphysics and epistemology class the way it's supposed to be. So this time I went back to basics and now we're doing like mind, metaphysics, and epistemology. But there are, if you have a chance to take a world philosophy course or a history of philosophy course, you absolutely should, because there are many rich philosophical traditions outside of the European tradition. Ancient Indian philosophy is very cool. Chinese philosophy is very cool too. And there's some really interesting African and indigenous philosophies. Um, yep, yep. They don't use those words, but yes, that's what they're talking about. They do talk about that. Um, yeah, one book you might want to check out. It's called The Roots of Wisdom by Helen Buss Mitchell. And her textbook is like a survey of all kinds of philosophical traditions from around the world. I don't have a copy here, but I also have this one. This is World Philosophies Historical Introduction. This was what I used in my undergraduate philosophy class. Um, and it has, I'll just read you from the table of contents. It has India, China, Greece. Um, it has medieval philosophy. It has more further developments in Asian philosophy. So um, talking about like Neo-Confucianism in China, Zen Buddhism in Japan, then the Renaissance, more recent non-Western philosophies, and then 20th century Western philosophy. So it's pretty good. It's pretty good. Um, so I recommend that, checking that out if you're interested in getting out of the Western canon. Um, but this is also starting to change. I think philosophy departments are realizing the importance of broadening what is taught. I mean, if we can have now I was actually pretty lucky because when I was an undergraduate, my prof specialty, the same one who Dr. Wayne Barodi from Nipissing University, the same fella who Schopenhauer made ill. He specialized in the ancient Greek and the ancient Indian, right? So he read ancient Greek, he read Sanskrit, he did his PhD in India. So I was just really lucky when I was an undergraduate. I got to learn, about some Eastern philosophy. So the ancient Indian, a little bit of Chinese, a little bit of Japanese. And it was really cool. But more and more places are incorporating more sort of world philosophies into their curricula, which is nice. Yeah, I haven't read the Tao of Pooh, but I do have a copy of the Tao Te Ching at home. Um, so it's good stuff. If you have a chance to learn about some of that stuff, definitely do. There is quite a lot of overlap um, between these different schools. A lot of the great thinkers from around the world at different times and places have asked the same questions and come up with some of the same answers. It's not like these European thinkers were the only ones to think of this stuff. There were people before and after in different parts of the world wondering about a lot of the same stuff. So why don't we leave it there for today? So okay, let's minimize this chat here. So next week we're going to be covering chapter 7. So that's about things. So we're getting back to particulars, to individual entities. I'm still working on that list of essay topics. I'd like to have it released for the weekend. I've already asked you this, an answer key. Yeah, I'll probably go over the answers to the test and I'll make it available as an unlisted video because I really don't want the answer key getting out. And I will look into why you can't view your feedback. I think now that I think about it, it's probably because the availability of the quiz is restricted after it ends. So after the due date, you might not be able to see the quiz anymore. So I'll have to fix that. So I'll look into that later today. And then when the answer key is available, you can compare your answers to my answers, see how you did. All right, so that's all for today, everyone. I'll see you next week. Have a good weekend. Take care of yourselves, and yeah, I'll have those materials ready for you as soon as I can. Bye for now.